Okay, good to go?
Good to go, yes.
All right, so welcome everyone. Good to see so many faces, especially students.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, nice turnaround.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tanya Doody from CSIRO, Australia, one of the world leading research agencies, not only in Australia, but internationally. Tanya's most famously known for her evapotranspiration work, and she will be presenting on groundwater-dependent ecosystems today for us. If there are questions, we will manage between the Spanish and the English, yes. So no problem. Just ask, and we try to translate and get the question to Tanya and the response back to you. So please don't worry about the language. We'll manage. And Tanya, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you, everyone, for coming along. So hopefully my English is okay for you as well, and I don't talk too fast, which I tend to do. So as Christian mentioned, I do a lot of work with trees especially and evapotranspiration, but everything I do falls under this big umbrella of groundwater-dependent ecosystems. So this is a key example of a groundwater-dependent ecosystem, but I'll describe them in more detail as we go along. So I won't keep saying groundwater-dependent ecosystem because it's difficult, so it's GDE. So if you hear me say GDE, I'm talking about these ecosystems. So they're areas across the world in all landscapes where we have vegetation or other flora and fauna that at some point uses groundwater. So not only do these ecosystems use rainfall and river water, but they access groundwater. That's the really important part of these ecosystems. Because we can't see groundwater, we actually generally don't manage groundwater well around the world. But so if groundwater changes, then we'll start to damage these ecosystems. And in Australia, in many places, we have actually seen ecosystem collapse as a result of removal of groundwater. So there's three types of GDEs. There are ones that are surface expression of groundwater. So it's springs that come up to the surface, it's rivers, it's terrestrial fauna. So when you think of GDEs, it's not just the water, and it's not just flora or fauna in the ecosystem. It could be a bird that's traveling from maybe Costa Rica, stopping at the ecosystem and flying to Australia. That's an important ecosystem, that bird itself. Then we have the subsurface expression of groundwater, and so that's vegetation. So what that means is your trees are on the surface, but their roots are going down and accessing and taking groundwater to survive, as well as rainfall and other sources of water. And then we have the unseen GDEs, and these are within aquifers and caves. Really important, very unstudied. They're called stygofauna, and I'll provide some examples after, and also something called troglofauna. So stygofauna live in the water, in a cave. Troglofauna live outside in the air, but access the water within a cave system. So for Australia, for example, it's very semi-arid to arid. So most areas across the nation, our species of vegetation and flora at some point will probably access groundwater unless they're adapted to live in drought-stricken areas. And the problem with changes to groundwater is that it can impact these ecosystems, as I mentioned before. So availability of groundwater can change. And this is a result of human development generally. So we have agriculture, we have mining, we have dewatering of mines. So the mines pump the groundwater out, put it in a stream, and that stream flows off somewhere else. But you've also changed the ecosystem of the stream at the same time with this water. Ultimately, what this does, these changes to groundwater, leads to decline in health of the flora and the fauna. And I'll focus on trees especially because it's easier to see the change in health of trees. And like I was saying before, leads to ecosystem collapse. So in Australia, for the last 20+ years, we've been working really hard to identify groundwater dependent ecosystems, but more importantly, make sure they're protected. And in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a noticeable increase of interest in GDEs across America, China, and Europe. So it's really good to see that some of the research that we've been leading in Australia is becoming more useful worldwide. So just give some examples, and I like photos. So all of these photos are from my travels for work generally. So over on this side, the right for me, we have a beach, and you can't see it, but there's groundwater, hot groundwater under that sand that bubbles up. So if you dig away the sand, you've got a hot thermal spring. That's a groundwater dependent ecosystem. The middle photo there is a stream in Nepal. So this is a stream that's intermittent. So when there's no snow flow going through, it's groundwater that's providing that little bit of water that's there. This is another stream in Nepal, but it's a permanent stream. And again, there are groundwater inflows into that stream, which help maintain that water permanently. In Australia, these are very common springs in the middle. So you might have heard of the outback. It's very dry, very arid. But we have these little oases, which is groundwater that's come up to the surface, often thermal, but huge habitat for many species, but also really important to our Indigenous people to provide water and food. Then we have the subsurface GDEs. And so this is just a conceptual model to show that we have the groundwater, we have the capillary fringe of the soil that's within that vadose zone or the unsaturated zone. So what the trees can do is put their roots down to that capillary fringe and they can access groundwater from there. The really important thing here is that once groundwater is getting to deeper than 10 metres, it does become harder and harder for vegetation to access it. However, if that was sand, the groundwater could be 30 metres and the trees could access it. So one of the key things to managing groundwater dependent ecosystems is actually the depth to groundwater. And this is some example of those stygofauna. So they're funny little micro species. These are all from under a scale. This is just a photo of a cave, so full of water, but it's home to these probably unique fish. I've got some people in my group back at work, and they go up to Northern Australia. So they're looking at stygofauna and trying to understand the impacts of mining on groundwater. So they have a bore. So that's this photo over here. The way they find out what stygofauna are in that bore is using a fishing rod. So they have bait fishing rod, and they've been able to catch little animals like this, which have been unique to that aquifer and cave system. So really important in terms of managing that groundwater resource for mining. If we affect the groundwater, we'll kill all those unique species. And this is just some other examples. So it's really just, these photos are really just to convey that they're worldwide. There are beautiful features in the landscape, but they also support some of our iconic species around the world. So these are some photos from Africa and Australia and Nepal probably. So we've got elephant, giraffe. Giraffe is groundwater dependent because it's drinking the water from a spring that's got groundwater in it. So it's really important to think about it's the animals that are groundwater dependent as well. Lions, this one here is some spoonbills in Australia, vegetation, all groundwater dependent ecosystems. So how do we manage these ecosystems? There's some specific characteristics that help us to do that. So as I mentioned, the depth to groundwater is really important. We need to be able to know what that is. The pressure of the groundwater, or the force at which it's coming to the surface, is also really important. And that's important for the confined aquifers. Then we have the rate and the volume of groundwater supply. And of course, particularly for the in-stream biota, stygofauna, water quality is also really important. Today, I'll probably just talk more about groundwater level. Just a conceptual model to show that different GDEs have a different level of reliance on groundwater. So if you're in that stream area, you're a reed, you're in wet conditions all the time, you're very probably permanently dependent on groundwater. As you move up the bank of a stream, you're less dependent. So you lose the groundwater a lot of the time. It could be 80% of your water requirements. Moving up the stream a bit more and up the elevation, you start to use a bit more rainfall. So the species are modified or adapted to live in drier conditions. When it gets too dry, then they can access the groundwater. Moving up again through that bank system, groundwater's deeper. When the trees are running out of soil water, then they'll access groundwater, but that's more occasional. It could be 1 or 2 times a year. And then we have our rainfall dependent species that are out here. So in total, they probably don't access groundwater at all. And that's much of our species in Australia that are in the outback, because groundwater is at about 100 metres. So over the years, we've developed many methods, particularly using remote sensing to map where groundwater dependent ecosystems are. Because if we want to manage them, we actually need to know where they are first. So what I'll talk about next is some of the knowledge gaps to the research that's been undertaken. So we've established these methods. One thing that we've developed in Australia, this image here, is something called the GDE Atlas. This is an online atlas with polygons identifying where groundwater dependent ecosystems are: vegetation, springs, wetlands, that sort of thing. However, one thing that we don't really know is how much water do the GDEs need? And obviously, as I was saying, different GDEs need different amounts of water. So we talk about this as, what are their water requirements? When do they need water? How much water do they need? How long do they need it for? These are some of the things that we're still struggling with after 25 years of research. But I'll provide some examples of how we can go about understanding those water requirements. And field validation is absolutely critical. Particularly for mapping, we have to have field validation to know that our maps are telling the truth. So here's an example of some of our mapping outside the GDE Atlas. This is a method using radar that I was involved in a couple of years ago. The top image there is the GDE Atlas data. When we did the atlas, we had really large vegetation polygons, so not very accurate. But this radar method, I think our spatial resolution was 5 meters. And so you can see how much more refined our mapping of GDEs is in this bottom image there. Not only that, radar sees through clouds. So really important for tropical areas, Costa Rica, for example. So you can map regularly using radar. And of course, there's different scales in terms of management that we need to understand where GDEs are. So like I was mentioning, the GDE Atlas, national. Often we're working at regional or catchment scales, but sometimes it might be a much smaller scale. So scale is really important in understanding the different techniques we might need to apply in order to understand where GDEs are and what their water requirements are. The key thing here is there is really a huge lack of field validation studies. And so that's something I'm working on, trying to improve across different areas of the world at the moment. How do we determine where GDEs are by field studies? I know many of you are aware of isotopes. That is actually really critical to help us know if an area is a GDE, whether it's a plant or an animal or a spring even. Water balance measurements. So as Christian said, ET, evapotranspiration, is what I do. And so I use those water balance methods to understand when, where, and how much water the trees need, particularly. Groundwater samples, really important. So we can look at aquifer and cave GDEs. Groundwater flux studies, there's been a few of those in Australia where you just monitor bores and look at different flux changes over the course of a day, month, year. Qualitative field studies. So I know of a situation in the States where there's a creek, the creek dries up, but when the trees lose their leaves in autumn or fall, the creek starts flowing again, even though there's been no rainfall. that's a really good indication that those trees were using groundwater. The isotope studies identified conclusively that the trees use groundwater. And then leaf water potential measurements or some ecophysiology is a really good way of understanding how stressed trees are. So if they've got high water stress, they're probably not accessing groundwater. If it's hot, it's dry, their water stress is low, they probably are accessing groundwater. So I'll run through a couple of examples that have come out of work that I've been a part of in Australia. So this photo in the middle is a floodplain or a riverine area in the Murray-Darling Basin, which takes up 1/8 of the land surface of Australia. We have 3 tree species, which are really important. And during, I think it was 2000 to 2010, we had the millennium drought. Many of the trees on these floodplains, only 15% were in good condition. So we were trying to understand what their water requirements are. We did a multiple lines of evidence study. So we used sap flow, groundwater depth and salinity, isotopes, and pre-dawn water potentials. And what these graphs on the left here are showing, through isotope studies, we knew that groundwater is at 5 meters, but through isotope studies, we could demonstrate that all of these species, and the red circle is at 5 meters of groundwater, accessed groundwater during many times of the year. So it goes from September through till March over 3 years. So even trees that were in a riverbank next to the river actually also use groundwater as well. In this study, we didn't know how much groundwater they used because we didn't do any soil measurements. However, in this study, we did all of those factors that I just talked about, but we also had some fine scale soil measurements using a neutron moisture probe. So every 30 centimeters, we were able to measure how much soil moisture there was. And we did this every 2 weeks. So these were forest plantations that were often deliberately planted over very shallow groundwater of about 5 meters. And so for management reasons, we needed to understand how much water was coming from the groundwater. The reason for this was the farmers paid to pump groundwater to irrigate their crops, but the plantation owners were essentially getting groundwater for free. So this research then led to the plantation owners having to pay for the groundwater they were extracting, which was a lot fairer. With water balance studies, we knew the rainfall, we knew total evapotranspiration, and we knew the change in the soil moisture. What the red oval there is showing is exactly how much groundwater was being used a year. So in some of these plantations, they were using 400 millimeters a year of groundwater, which is probably well over half of their water use. Because we did these measurements 2 weekly, we can actually look at the data and see when and how much groundwater they use at a much finer scale, which is really rare data to find. Another example is, again, a plantation study. These plantations were over a limestone cave. And so I was able to get in a cave. There was these tree roots over here. You can't see them very well, sorry. It was a long time ago. Photography wasn't so good. But I went down into the cave. It was 14 meters. You could see the roots in the groundwater. I put sap flow sensors in the roots of the trees, sap flow sensors in the tree trunk. And what we could do was actually calculate that 22% of water for that one tree came directly from groundwater. Therefore, it's a groundwater dependent ecosystem. So these are just examples of how we identify that these ecosystems exist. Next steps is really around using some of this data that I have especially, but trying to mine from other people around the world data that they might have that can help us develop models, and Christian is a part of this, that can help us predict how much groundwater is being extracted and when it's being extracted by these ecosystems, especially trees. So this graph here is from that plantation study. If I look at the 2 weekly data, what I could see was that in spring and summer, large amounts of groundwater were used by these trees. And that makes sense because in our summers, it's very dry and it's very hot. What was interesting though, is that in autumn, when it's cooling down, there was still quite a lot of groundwater being used. And that was predominantly because we'd had no rain over summer. So if we didn't have rain and we didn't have the groundwater, those trees would start to drop their leaves and not look quite so good. But also in a plantation setting, productivity would decline significantly, which obviously isn't good for the financial side of things. So in summary, I hope I've shared, just the beauty, I guess, for me of what groundwater dependent ecosystems are, but the importance of managing them so that we can make sure that we can maintain ecosystem services, ecosystem functions, but also biodiversity. And really, making sure we're leaving an environment for our next lots of generations over time to come. We all like to take water from the environment, but it is actually really important to understand the impacts of groundwater extractions. So thank you. This is one of my field sites, actually. It's pretty bad, isn't it?
Tanya, thanks, Tom. Such a great example of really policy relevant research.
Yeah.
It makes us think about groundwater dependent ecosystems in Costa Rica as well. So if there are questions, please try to formulate your question in English or in Spanish, and we get it across the time.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. It is very interesting. I'd like to ask, how could be the process of the communication with the politicians or people in the government, because your information is very important for the countries and the regions, but it needs to be applied.
Yeah, that's a great question. And with the plantation work, the government were paying for some of that research. Yeah, and that's pretty much what happens in Australia. To have impact on policy, government pays. Many of the plantation owners pay for it as well. So, yeah, we had the two sides. So it was politically tense. So we were in the middle. We had to manage the situation and just provide solid research that could inform policy. So
I think it is great because they are taking decisions. It is not that they are ignoring you, they are taking decisions.
Yeah.
It is very...
Yeah, and so the government altered policy for Australia so that now if plantations have groundwater shallower than 6 meters, they pay a specific amount of money per year for that groundwater extraction.
Maybe just to make people aware, this happens very often in other parts of the world, that the government actually hire research to take decisions. That doesn't exist over here.
No.
Okay.
I'm not sure what you do then.
Everything.
Wow.
This might come to surprise, So CSIRO is a governmental research agency, and this exists in the US, USGS, and EPA, in Europe as well. Okay, so many scientists get paid from the government, to deliver information.
Well,
Which is pretty much a good way, right?
Because
you create the evidence.
Yeah.
To take decisions.
Do they expect like a financial gain?
The government?
Yeah.
No.
It's just not gonna.
No.
I mean, if it were to happen here, probably they'd expect a financial gain. From that research, I guess.
Yes, but again, they do have a gain, which is the reduction of risk. So they have through funding research, they actually save a lot of money in trying to fix.
Trying to fix, yeah.
There's really things backwards here.
I'm sure we do have those situations.
Yeah.
but
that will manage that thing.
Yeah, but in this particular one, it is really about that fairness and protecting the environment. It's a good question. I've never thought about what they do with the money that plantations pay for.
Yeah, I guess it's just like probably the national.
I'm gonna ask. That's a really good question. Pascal.
Very interesting talk. Thank you, Tanya. I have several questions. One has to do with this very last issue that in Costa Rica there is a payment for water users, canon de agua, canon de aprovechamiento, which is consumptive and non-consumptive use of water.
Yep.
And that money goes usually to monitor groundwater, actually, and other issues with the Directorate of Water Management of the Ministry of Environment. So there are some rudimentary financial arrangements for monitoring, for financing these kinds of research. It's nothing close to the type of research CSIRO is involved in, but there is a similar issue. I had a question whether you have any karstic landscapes in Australia, and whether within karstic landscapes, which here there aren't many karstic landscapes in Costa Rica, but in northern Central America and in Mexico and Yucatan, you have 100% groundwater dependent ecosystems, because you have very little surface water, and practically all water is underground. So I was just wondering whether you've applied that method to karstic landscapes also.
That plantation research, all karstic.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And we have a lot of karstic areas across Australia, to the point where it is at surface and there's only little bits of soil. So the plantations, there is some deep soil over limestone, and so those plantations weren't groundwater dependent, but otherwise, if the soil was shallow, then for sure. And that was the high water use of 400 millimeters a year.
Wow.
Yeah,
It's
a lot. Yeah.
With a rainfall that's under
600.
600, that's the slope.
Yeah.
600
to 700. Yeah, essentially. And in that region, there is no surface water, as you'd expect. We've got a couple of lakes, which was still groundwater fed. And so not only was it important for the water extraction, but it's also to protect the water resources for towns. And the springs, there was a lot of springs in the area that were drying up because of the groundwater use by the plantations. So there were many management effects, really, of that research impacts. And research is still going on. We're still measuring sap flow in that region. Last night, I did the final edits for a journal paper, which is improving the estimate for how much plantation owners need to pay for water, because they're currently paying too much, we've discovered, which meant that the area of plantations can't grow. But yeah, if we can refine that, they can actually grow the area of plantations a little bit more now, which is good for the economy, as well as managing the groundwater.
I have a question more on the education perspective. So it's always very hard to convince people that evapotranspiration is related to groundwater at some point. So what's your piece of advice on how to inform people in this connection between evapotranspiration and groundwater?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess it really just does come back to, in its most simplest forms, I will always speak in terms of trees, because I don't work on bushes. Trees are like us. They need water. They need to drink. They drink the rainfall. They drink the soil water, but they also drink groundwater. And it's just those, it's pictures is what I show of trees accessing, here's the tree, here's the unsaturated zone, here's the groundwater zone, and just demonstrating how the roots do go down into the groundwater or the capillary fringe. So I think pictures are the best way to do that. And there's plenty of river streams that you get the erosion and you can see the roots. So pictures like that are really handy, and you just get people to imagine, those roots just keep going down into the groundwater. Groundwater depth, it also helps. So if you can say, well, groundwater is only 5 meters, that tree's 30 meters, it's got to have a root system that's going to support it, its height as well. So it makes sense that those roots are going down deeper. Does that help?
No. We normally tend to see this as very kind of, separate things in the system. So
Yeah.
sometimes depending on the subject you are trying to present to your students, it's a very hard connection to make.
Yeah, there's some great images, conceptual images out there. And there's enough quantified data to demonstrate that that's the case too. I wish that photo of my tree roots in the cave was better, but that was a long time ago now.
There's experimental evidence now from Guanacaste, three species with 10-50 meter root systems going down into the groundwater system.
Yeah.
And I found it very nice at the beginning of the presentation because, normally in Costa Rica, we don't tend to think in terms of groundwater dependent ecosystems. We have plenty of rainfall, so a lot of systems that we would think they are not groundwater dependent, at the end they are.
And the thing is, they only need to access groundwater once in their entire lifetime, and they're groundwater dependent. Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. There's also the tropical areas of Australia. Half the year it is, it's raining, but that dry season, the trees use groundwater. So your tropical areas, you still have GDEs. Vegetation, the groundwater and the springs are a different situation.
I know the views, but I have one more question.
Please.
You've documented very well the dependency of ecosystems on groundwater.
Mm-hmm.
How dependent is the groundwater on the presence of these trees to be? Is there
really important?
Yeah.
So one of the key things, you might have heard of salinisation in Australia.
Yeah.
That's due to mass clearing of trees, which made the groundwater levels rise. We have a naturally hypersaline groundwater system in much of Central Australia. So once you're bringing that up to 7 or 8 meters close to the surface, the salts start to come up. So it's had a really significant impact. The groundwater levels do rely on the trees to stop salinity. And so that's why we then go through this process of greening and plantation forestry and all those sorts of things. Yeah. Another interesting situation has actually been, you've got regulation and locks and weirs here. Yep. So big locks across rivers that hold water. So instead of a free flowing river, there's essentially ponds. That changes the groundwater system outside the riverbanks. And so you start to have problems there because you've held water in and groundwater comes up. And so, yeah, big areas of salinisation, and you then have to pump that salt water away. We're very highly managed, it's terrible.
¿Alguien más? Tanya, one more thing, please.
Yes.
If nobody asks. The atlas.
The atlas, yes.
We are in geography, and I know you are spatial scientist.
I am.
As well. I mean, this is the way how to communicate and put information, open access out there. So if there are research findings, put it out in the form of an open access atlas.
Yeah.
So this is a great way to communicate and make information available to others. The question I have related to that is related to the upscaling issue. So you said that we need field evidence, so we need measurements, and then combine them with other methods to upscale and get to the whole of Australia.
So
how exactly?
there's a journal paper, and it talks about how we did this because expert opinion was important. So there were many lines of evidence, and I believe in anything we do, no one thing is correct. We need multiple lines of evidence to tell a story. So in doing the GDE Atlas of Australia, which I have to say was about $6 million back in 2010, that was a lot of money. We did a remote sensing approach using both Landsat and MODIS, two different and independent methods, which were known to be able to show groundwater-dependent ecosystems, scoured all the literature for any field studies that identified groundwater-dependent ecosystems. And then geology was important, hydrology, depth to groundwater information, vegetation mapping, soil mapping, you name it, any geological or geographical piece of information that would help inform was used in this atlas. So we end up with many, many layers. So think of a GIS with all these different layers of information. Then we had to come up with different rules. And so a rule was something like, okay, we know that tree species lives there because we've got the vegetation mapping. We know it's groundwater dependent because we've got the literature. We know it's got a shallow groundwater. Therefore, we can start to give it a potential of being a groundwater dependent ecosystem on a value of 0 to 10. So there were massive, massive spreadsheets with all of these different rules, bringing in all these multiple lines of evidence, which varied from location to location because you didn't have probably soil data for one area. So it was a massive integration. Once we created maps like this, then we got experts in. Have a look at an area that you're familiar with. Does this make sense? Do you think that this area was groundwater or is groundwater dependent? But the other thing too, you'll notice here, there is no vegetation mapping in Northern Territory in that area. So we actually don't have any mapping because it was all attached to vegetation polygons. And this map here is showing the vegetation. There is another part of the atlas that will show the springs and the rivers. There are other layers in the atlas, which are the remote sensing layers, which are also really useful. And the way we use this is as a guide. So if you're a mining company, you've got trees, you have to do an impact assessment, you go to the atlas, and it will say, okay, there could be groundwater dependent ecosystems there. Then the mining company has to go and do further detailed local studies to actually identify groundwater dependent ecosystems. So really, this is a mega, mega resource in Australia, highly used and guiding water management in an amazing way, which is, yeah, just really, really cool to have been a part of.
Great example.
Yeah, although I'm the lead author, all I led was the remote sensing. A consultancy company put the whole thing together. I was part of the whole project, but yeah, I'm just a part of a massive team for that one who got stuck with the journal paper.
Yeah, and it's great that you bring the qualitative information in as well.
Yeah, and this study helped me understand the importance of expert opinion because I'm very quantitative and not a fan of qualitative information in the past, but this taught me that it is, when you have nothing else and you're data poor, it's really, really important to have qualitative information. So I learned something.
Somebody else? Question? There are many take-home messages. Did you talk, Tanya? Okay.
Oh, just go out and look at the environment differently. Yeah.
Let's thank Tanya once again for the topic.
Thank you for coming along. It's fantastic.
Stick around a little bit. So there is coffee outside. Thanks to Anna Maria.
Thank you, Anna Maria.
Team effort here. So stick around if you want. Ask Tanya a question over coffee. If not, I'll see you later. Yes, no thanks.
Groundwater dependent coffee.
Yeah. We're groundwater dependent ecosystems too.